Welcome back. Well, now we've got Professor Magnus Sparkle joining us today. He's the CEO and Chief Strategist of Economic and Business Strategies. He's a former Chief Economic Advisor to the President and CEO of the National Planning Commission. He was a former National Coordinator of NAPEP. He joins us via Skype this morning. Good morning, and thank you for joining us today on the program. How are you holding up? How are you handling this lockdown period?
Well, we're locked down and collaborating with government to fight this scourge. I think we're going to be okay in the end. Good morning.
Okay, I know that some time ago, many years ago, when you were in maybe a similar position to handle economic matters and drive things forward. It's been a while, so maybe it might be appropriate to ask, do you still have the same passion to fighting poverty and seeing that things go right?
I absolutely do. Thank you very much, Shepard. You guys doing a good job. Well, as you know very well, poverty is the #1 challenge facing Nigeria and Africa. Unfortunately, this coronavirus has come to compound issues for us and making the issue even more complicated to the extent that I think that our poverty situation might worsen as a result of this problem. And so we have to be very deliberate and very focused and methodical as we try to fight this disease and combat all the ramifications of it.
Ever since you were in that saddle, driving the programs, economic programs, taking poverty, trying to sort that challenge headlong, there's been several other policies and programs that have been implemented. But now specifically about the concept of conditional cash transfer, which you also did bring to bear at the time. Tell us about it, how you wanted that to play out, what it was intended to achieve, and then perhaps what you've seen several years after.
Absolutely. Well, thank you. As you know, I hope most people know, that I basically introduced the conditional cash transfer program into Nigeria when I was working at NAPEP. The program actually, we conceived it, I think, about 2006, although it was launched in 2007. But the idea was to try to get the poorest of the poor back to get them into the mainstream economy. As you know, those people who are so poor that they literally are not able to function in the mainstream because they don't have the skills and they don't have the connections. And nobody should be left out in any country. The aim of government is to raise the level of living for the people, is to improve the welfare of the people, the well-being of the people. People want to be happy, that's what they want, and they want their government to provide social welfare for them whenever they are in difficulty. So what we did at the time, we saw that there was a large number of people that were disconnected from the mainstream economy, and they were poor, and they were unable to fight their way back into the mainstream. And what you needed to do was to have a program like the conditional cash transfer program to bring them back on stream. So at that time, luckily, a country like Mexico that had the longest conditional cash transfer program in the world, at least the best functioning welfare program, conditional cash transfer program in the world, we had to go to Mexico. I went to Mexico to understudy them to see what they were doing. And they had done so well, they became the darling of the World Bank. There was also another program in Brazil called Bolsa Familia that was also very successful. And the World Bank was touting these two programs, the one in Mexico and the one in Brazil, as the top programs that countries should copy because they were reducing poverty for them dramatically. Now, as we know, the #1 antidote to poverty is jobs. But there are times when people, as I said, are not able to get jobs because they don't have skills or whatever. So we tried to look at what the Mexicans were doing in their Oportunidades program. They then called it Prospera, which incidentally that program no longer exists because it was extremely expensive. So when I saw what they did, I realized that it would be extremely difficult for us in Nigeria or in Africa to replicate the kind of program they had in Mexico or in Brazil. And so we devised our own program. We designed a program that I thought was excellent in formulation, in the sense that we provided what was essential, a basic income guarantee that we call BIG, B-I-G, and then we also designed something that we call PRAI, like P-R-A-I, and that was a poverty reduction accelerated investment. So that means that we needed to find a way to accelerate the reduction of poverty in society by giving these very poor people access to loans so that they could also start their own businesses and then claw their way out of poverty. But much of it was premised on the fact that you need human capital development. One of the real reasons why Africa lags behind the world today is serious human capital deficiency. And that's at the root of much of the problems that we have throughout the developing world, especially in Africa. And so what we wanted to do was to be sure that we took care of the human capital problems that existed. In the household, when you gave the so-called BIG, that's the basic income guarantee, people had money to buy food, had money to look after to provide good nutrition for their kids that they never provided before. But most importantly, the access to the money was based on, was premised on, or conditional on, that's why they call it conditional cash transfer, conditional on the fact that the kids went to school and they did health checks so that in the future they would not be poor like their parents, to stop the so-called intergenerational transfer of poverty. So I think that we were very effective in doing this. We had to train the people to be successful in whatever businesses they were doing. If they were too the challenge, if they were too disadvantaged and never really were able to get a job, then we brought proxies that did the jobs for them, where we provided the poverty accelerator investment for them. But the important thing was that we wanted people to not stay on welfare forever. The Mexican program, even the Brazilian program, basically keeps people on welfare forever. And you don't want to create a situation of welfare dependency. And so we wanted to have a setup where we graduated people out of poverty. And I thought that we were effective with that program. Now, I suggested this program to this administration, and I have to commend the administration for being really committed to fighting poverty. It is not that easy to try to fight poverty in developing countries because you don't have the resources to do it quite as much. But this administration, I think that they've done well to address the issue. They've committed to the issue. They've put large amounts of money. They made large amounts of money available for the fight against poverty. And I see they have some pretty nice programs that they've set up. But I think that there is a confusion that exists out there in the sense that people looking at palliatives for the coronavirus situation are confusing those palliatives with the conditional cash transfer program. And I'm not sure who is at fault here, whether it is the government or it's just the people. Because I think that the government should do well to try to explain to the people that there is a big difference between the palliatives that you want to use to fight the job losses or the income losses that people get from their job losses due to the coronavirus and the conditional cash transfer that you give to the people because they're extremely poor.
If you don't mind me quickly butting in there, I think that's really where the people are having issues. We'll come to the palliatives that you mentioned, but the conditional cash transfer thing, one of the controversies that surrounded that is the rationale behind how you come up with the list of the poorest of the poor. Now, you understand this one way or another. Could you educate us? Because people are really concerned about how do you know the poorest of the poor? In which way? What are the criteria, the parameters used to select the poorest of the poor in each community? I think that's one of the issues that people would want to understand. What's your...
Absolutely. That's a very, very good question. That is at the crux of the issue. It is really a little bit tricky to make that to try to have that type of selection when you try to, because the problem is that there is a political economy that attends targeted programs like the conditional cash transfer program. Anytime you have a program that is not available for everybody, for example, homeschool feeding program is a fantastic program. People don't fight it that much because every kid that is in school benefits from it. Sort of a social security program for old people or older people is a good program because everybody can have access to it. But when you have a conditional cash transfer program like this, where you have to select people, then you run into serious political economy issues. And I think that's one of the things that this government has to try to address. What we did when we did it was to go into a community and to divide the community into sections. And we allowed the people to choose those they thought were the poorest of the poor. But we did that with support, strong support from the state government. I think that's something I'm hoping that this administration is doing it. They've got to involve all the stakeholders, starting with the National Assembly, something that I wish we had done a little stronger at the time, I might add. But you've got to involve the National Assembly, especially the guys, the senators, and the members of the House of Representatives that represent their people to be parties to the selection process. But most importantly, the governor of the state has to be directly in charge of whatever is happening in the state. It cannot just be a federal government program that is drilled down from Abuja. If you do it like that, it will surely fail. And so I'm hoping that what they've done, because what I did, was to put the program under the supervision of the governor of the state. I had the governor appoint a chairman of a committee that implemented the program. One thing that I see that most federal governments have to really pay more attention to is to see themselves as being catalytic in doing things, and not see themselves as being the only party that can do it, because if they do so, they will fail, especially in developing countries like ours. Our federal government, for that matter, any government, does not have all the power in the world to do whatever it is that they want to do, because they don't have the resources to do that. What I mean by power is the ability. They don't have it. So they have to be catalytic and make sure that they get strong support from state governments. They get strong support from the National Assembly. They have transparency for the people. They are able to communicate the message to the people. I had something called community economic sensitization, where we sensitize the people. We're very active. Some people may remember we had vehicles that went around the country educating people on what we were doing. It is extremely important that you get the buy-in of all the stakeholders, especially the people that you are serving. I think that the confusion we have now would not exist if we have, I believe, a little bit more sensitization, because I think that they are doing pretty good. I think they're up to the mark, but they have to sensitize the people a little bit more.
Prof, one of the things that I know you are passionate about, but which you haven't mentioned at all in all of these conversations that we've had so far, is that of data. Now, for you, is this approach that government's using data-driven, or is it a political or emotional decision or action that government is taking at this time?
Well, thank you very much. I'm happy that you mentioned data. Something that's extremely important to me when I first came back home as chief economic advisor to President Obasanjo was looking at data. You cannot give a policy advice that is not evidence-based. Oftentimes we begin to work without the information, without the data, and I think that everybody is suffering from that problem. And we have to use this occasion, to try to make sure that we address that issue. For example, right now, if you want to give palliatives to people, you will be hard-pressed to know how to do it. And I suspect that probably that's why we're confused. I see that the president has added another 1 million to the role of those getting the conditional cash transfer program. And that's very, very good. And I commend the president for that. But most people are thinking that that's a way of addressing the issue of income losses for people who have lost their jobs because of the coronavirus. But the question is, where is the register of the people who have lost their jobs because of the coronavirus? Very difficult to get. Now, you might be able to support some of these people who are working in formal situations where the company has a tax identification number. You can have those companies who have been paying taxes to show the roles of their employees that are affected, that are suffering job losses as a result of this. But what about those who are in the informal economy? Those guys who are working at the shopping centers, those guys who are selling on the road, there's no register that picks up those kinds of people. I know that we may have some sort of a social welfare register that picks up people who are on home school feeding program, on conditional cash transfer program, on Empower. They will have the register for them. But I'll be hard-pressed to see how you have a register for somebody that is selling peanuts on the roadside. or somebody that is a run boy, a guy who runs a businesses for somebody working at a shopping center. Very difficult to do that. But there is a way around it, though. Maybe we don't have time on this
Let me ask you.
platform to discuss it, but there's a way around it, I think.
Okay, you know, when you talk about the process of getting the figures of the poorest of the poor, getting the community involved and determining who should be on that list, how do you then deal with those who will tell you, but wait a minute, look at the World Bank figures of the amount of people that are poor in Nigeria, certainly way over 50, 60, 70 million, and then you have this figure of those who you say are poorest of the poor. How do you reconcile those figures?
Well, I always challenge the World Bank to show me where they get their data from. I'm not saying that they are wrong, but I always like to use the data provided by our own government because we are the ones that do the primary data research. But of course, the World Bank usually supports us when we collect the data. There is confusion now. If you go to the MBS, you'll be hard pressed to know exactly what the poverty rate is today. I think that they're using numbers from 2009, which pushed us somewhere around 62, 63%. Then the World Bank has their own numbers that says the extreme poverty rate is about 48 to 50%. So we've got all these kinds of numbers that are running around. We need to find a way that we reconcile these numbers, but I think we should always take charge. We should not allow the World Bank or the IMF or anybody to dictate to us. We should do our own primary research, collect our own data, and I commend the National Bureau of Statistics, for the work they are doing. They've done an extremely good job, from how it used to be. I mean, this is a much, much better MBS than what we used to have in the old days when I first started working in that arena. But I think that there's a lot more work that still needs to be done. We need to collect more data. We need to have this register we're talking about, even those in the informal economy. We need to find a way of reaching them, assessing them. Now, let's look at this. Suppose now this coronavirus thing gets worse going down the road. It's going to be really tricky because I think it's a little easier to deal with the importation of the virus. So you can check the international transmission or migration of the virus. But it's a little bit more difficult to try to address or check the community migration of the virus because of too much porosity or even the wide openness of relationships. So that means you got to be able to get a little bit more data than we are getting now. I have tried to suggest to some members of government on some ways that we can use to have a little bit more checks on data on the people. I mean, that the data that they're participating in that is in their own interest to be included in, so that when we have times of emergency, you know how to quickly jump in and address. But as I mentioned earlier, when this administration came in 2015, I handed them a good stock of information on the conditional cash transfer program. I know that it was passed to them because I can see that they use some of the information that I've given to them. They are using them today. But I would have liked one thing to happen. I think that there should be a good deal of continuity between governments. As I said before, I know that there's a political economy that we face when we're looking at targeted programs like this. But we have to have a continuity. If an ordinary person is doing some research and goes on the internet to try to find out what has been happening in the arena of the conditional cash transfer since it was started, they will see a complex of things. They will see things that will be confusing. You see some of the things that we did that I implemented, and then you see some of the things that they are doing now, and you not know which is which. You'll be quite confused knowing what this administration is doing or what the other administration did. I think that we need to find a way to connect the dots. Make sure that this connects with the previous thing so we can say, in the past, this is what was done, and this is what we're built on, so people can understand. I think that that's extremely important. When you get the buy-in of people, a program tends to be more successful. But it takes a good deal of effort to try to reach people using stakeholders. And I've tried to identify some of the stakeholders, saying it's extremely pivotal to use the National Assembly, work very closely with them. The criticality of the National Assembly in this is enormous. You've got to use them. The senators, the members that have represented the people, but most importantly, governors of states and their authorities of the people. These guys should be working with the government
Right.
in great tandem, with the federal government in great tandem.
Well, we see there's some conversation to that regard between the National Assembly and the ministry. But earlier on, you said that, this conditional cash transfer is different from the palliative. So while the government is ramping up, the figures in that social register, there's also the big talk about palliatives, which you say is not really being addressed by the CC team. And, you talked about a register. We've seen other countries opening register. If you're unemployed at this point, if you have lost income, let's get you to register. And you mentioned specifically that would be very difficult in Nigeria. But then it still can be done. Government has a way of reaching the people. So, people will say, how about use USSD codes and all that? So is it really difficult if we want to get a register of people that have lost income, jobs at this time?
Well, it is not difficult if you have a good approach to it. But if you have what they call in Nigeria a fire brigade approach to it, then it's going to be difficult. You cannot come right now suddenly and have that type of list, because everybody will want to register on the list and you may not get good information. So you have to have proxy measures to deal with that. But I think it is not that difficult to have that well ahead of time. And I think that this experience now is teaching us a very good lesson. And people also should take it easy on the government. There is only so much the government can do. We are in a country where we are not producing as well as we should. And that's because of certain skills that we do not have. And that is one thing people don't realize. Some of our poverty is because we're not able to import some of the things we need to import. In the old days, when people thought the economy was better, was because our exchange rate was a little better. The naira was stronger, and you could buy computers, you could buy microwave ovens, you could buy things a little cheaper. But the naira is relatively weaker now compared to then. And people's incomes have not risen, in accordance. So it makes it a little bit difficult for people to get those types of things that they need to use as capital to drive production within the country.
Right. Let me just squeeze this in before we wrap up the conversation. We've talked about data, we've talked about human capital, and some other areas, but the money. Because the truth is, we can talk about data, we can talk about other things, but where will this money come from? What approach do you suggest? Just the federal government and the state government, or do we have, some private partnership? Where do we get the money from? Briefly.
Absolutely. Very good question. Now, as I said before, I truly commend, I'm not kidding, I commend the federal government in what they're doing. I think that they have paid, in my view, good attention to the issue. But because it's complicated, they need to set up partnerships. When I was in government, I set up something called the Multi-Partner Matching Funds Scheme. And what that did was the federal government became catalytic in the provision of funds. So you provide a certain amount of money and the states match it, and even banks contributed. So I have to mention this. There are certain states that were exemplary, because in those days I saw Governor Peter Obi was on your program the other day, and he was one of the governors that really collaborated with us to try to work the poverty rate down. So much in his own state, he was like one of the, probably at the top of the states that have very low poverty rates. We had a bank at that time like Oceanic Bank that contributed billions of naira to our programs, and we put it under the leadership of the governors. We had the governor of River State at the time, the governor of Bayelsa State at the time, the governor of Katsina State at the time, Kaduna State, many governors, and Ogun State, I might add, many governors contributed. So we were basically catalytic in the provision of funds. And that was how we looked bigger than people thought that we were. I mean, bigger than we actually were. People thought we were big, but we were not as big as we looked. But we became big because of the collaboration that we got from the stakeholders, especially working with state
Just one more thing.
Yes.
One more thing before we go, and we'll have, if you could, in about 30 seconds. Yes, it's good to focus on the poorest of the poor, but there are just others who are slightly above that category, that cadre as well. But during the time while you ran this, did you think about us having a social security number? What were the challenges? Why didn't that happen?
I think we should have it. I think that there's a lot that we can do. I think that there's time for us to do it. For developing countries is not easy. We're not the only countries in this kind of predicament. This is what happens when you're a developing country. But I think in Nigeria we have the ingenuity, we have the resiliency to be able to do it. And I'm pretty confident that we can do it if we want to do it.
All right, then, Professor Magnus Wakol, CEO and Chief Strategist, Economic and Business Strategies, former Chief Economic Advisor to the President, and CEO, National Planning Commission, and former National Coordinator of NAFEP. Thank you very much indeed for talking to us this morning.